All right, good afternoon. And I know it's 3 o'clock in the afternoon, so typically we do our webinars early, but today it's a special webinar. So I'm Jeff Winthal. I'm part of the program committee here at GPLH, and so welcome to a webinar, Updates from Capitol Hill, Financial and Political Threats Facing Nonprofits. It's great to see you all and our speaker this afternoon. But before we start, just want to make sure that everyone's aware that we have our next upcoming program, which is free for members. We have our next connections call on Thursday, August 13th, and that's at 8:30 in the morning. Just so you know, the connections calls are informal meetings that we have, which is an open forum where we can ask each other questions, get advice from peers, vent your frustrations if you have any, support one another, and share what trends we're seeing in the outside in the public. If you're not a member and you pay for this event, we'll happily apply that fee to your annual membership. And you can go to our website to become a member using coupon code SAVE30. And we'll drop in the chat the join us link if you're interested. And for this recording, we will distribute an email with the recording and slides for those who are registered for this webinar, along with any materials as well too. And that'll also be on the website as well. And lastly, there'll be a survey sent about this program so we can get some feedback from you. Just a couple of house rules. Please mute yourself until the end, and please refrain from using any AI scribes or note-taking software. They can be, I guess, they can be distracting to some extent. And we'll also have a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, we'll be doing a Q&A. And there you go. So here I am. I'm going to introduce you to our lovely speaker. So today's speaker is Sarah Saadian. Did I pronounce your last name correctly?
Saadian. Very
Sa-
close though.
Saadian. Thank you. Sorry about that. Thank you. Sarah Saadian. She's the Senior Vice President of Public Policy and Campaigns with the National Council of Nonprofits. She has more than 15 years of experience with national advocacy campaigns and has successfully advanced federal policies on Capitol Hill. Prior to joining the National Council of Nonprofits, Sarah served as Senior Vice President at the National Low Income Housing Coalition and worked as a Senior Analyst at Enterprise Community Partners. She graduated from UConn, or University of Connecticut School of Law, after receiving a bachelor's degree from the University of Virginia, and she's a member of the Virginia State Bar. So, with that being said, welcome, Sarah.
Thank you so much for having me today. I am really looking forward to our conversation about what's happening in Capitol Hill and how that impacts all of the work that you're doing in your community. And I think Jeff is going to share my slides, but I'll start to walk through it. I'd love to just spend 1 second introducing our organization to you. I'm with the National Council of Nonprofits. We are the largest network of nonprofits in North America. We work primarily through our state and regional associations of nonprofits. And together, that is a network of about 40,000 organizations across the country. So when we go to Capitol Hill, we are fighting on behalf of those 40,000 organizations, but also we like to say that we're working on behalf of the full nonprofit sector, 1.4 million organizations nationwide. Next slide, please. I'm here to talk a little bit about the enormous political threats facing nonprofits in DC. Jeff, do you mind going to the next slide, please? We're on the map still.
Oh, it's not working? It's working for me. Why it's not working for you guys? 1 second. Sorry about this,
Yeah,
guys.
no worries.
All right, let me try one more time. All right, PowerPoint. There it is. All right, let me know if you see the screen. Yes, the PowerPoint.
Yeah,
And if it's in, you see the whole slide?
we
And
see the map slide. There we go.
okay,
Perfect.
okay.
Thank you so much. So I assume it's not a surprise to all of you to hear that nonprofits are facing really unprecedented and historic threats, both financial threats, but also political threats. I'm going to talk through what we're seeing at the national level and how we hear that impacts you, but I'd love to hear from you about how it's impacting the work that you do. Next slide. When we look across the different threats that have emerged over the last 18 months, what we see is that the sector is facing an existential threat. Many of our organizations won't make it through this very tumultuous period. We know that it is putting organizations under enormous strain. But our philosophy about how we approach this time and this work is that we're either going to emerge out of this time stronger, more coordinated, more empowered, or we're going to let the moment that we're in overwhelm the nonprofit sector and we'll emerge weakened. And so we're going into this moment really thinking about how do we set ourselves not only survive this moment but come out stronger on the other end. Next slide. So first I want to talk about the financial threats facing nonprofit organizations. Next slide. So starting in January of last year, we started to see a very across the board, across government approach to ways to cut off federal funding to nonprofits and the nonprofit sector. And really the first item we saw coming out of the White House was last January, 1 week into the new administration. The Office of Management and Budget sent a memo to all federal agencies freezing all federal assistance funds, which is about $3 trillion almost overnight. And in that moment, NCN realized that the old way of us doing our work needed to change, that the threats that we were going to be seeing this year were going to be bigger than we have before, and that we needed to adapt in that moment. And so we decided to file litigation. We worked all night. After the announcement was made, we worked to identify nonprofits who were directly impacted. We worked with our attorneys. And by the next morning, we filed litigation to stop OMB from freezing these funds. We currently won. We have a nationwide preliminary injunction in place. We're waiting for a final decision from the court after the administration appealed that lower court decision. But we were able to see that within 48 hours, there was so much political pressure that the administration was forced to rescind that memo and allow federal dollars to continue. But that was a sign of the stress, the financial stress of what was to come. Next slide, please. So once the courts held that OMB couldn't unilaterally freeze all funding across the board, we saw a shift in tactics. So the administration moved towards cutting off federal funding program at a time, every program at a time, across federal agencies. So this looked in a lot of different ways. That could be that they were delaying funds or delaying NOFOs, delaying awards, denying funds, terminating grants halfway through, terminating contracts, refusing to renew government contracts, clawing back money. Lots of different tactics were used over the last several months. Overall, more than $400 billion has been withheld, mostly from state and local governments and nonprofits who work with the federal government to deliver services. All of this has resulted in lots of litigation. There's over 200 lawsuits that have been filed last time I checked. But each organization or each nonprofit had to sue on every single particular program where there was a funding challenge being made. Next slide. More recently, we've seen other efforts by the administration to, again, discourage nonprofits from even applying for federal funds or from accepting new federal grants, because by increasing the legal risks and the financial risks that nonprofits would face if they chose to take on federal dollars. So the first was that earlier this year in March, the administration proposed changing the sam.gov website, which is the Systems Award Management website, where anybody who's applying for a federal grant has to go on and click off on a series of certifications before they can even apply for federal dollars. And those certifications would require grantees to attest under a penalty of civil and criminal law that they were in compliance with the president's executive orders related to diversity, equity, and inclusion, immigration, and terrorism. And the challenging thing here in that proposed rule is that a lot of the language in the new certifications were incredibly vague. So, for example, what the administration has said is illegal DEI that people can't comply with is very different than what courts have said is illegal DEI. So what does it mean for a nonprofit to be in compliance? Does it mean that they would be subject to potentially criminal penalties if they didn't interpret the law the way the administration did, or if they didn't know how the administration might interpret those laws in the future? The comment period for that proposed change has closed, but we're expecting a second comment period soon. We're not sure exactly when. When that comment period happens, we'll update our materials and we'll encourage nonprofits to weigh in about how it's really difficult for them to sign a certification under such intense penalties without really knowing exactly what they're signing on to. The second change that we are seeing is something that we're responding to in this moment right now, which is, and I'll go into more details, but the administration is proposing really sweeping changes to how the federal government administers grants. And this is a 400-page document with changes throughout. I'll talk about some of the biggest changes, the most harmful changes later on. But essentially, it would increase the financial risk for nonprofits to accept a federal grant. And ultimately, we're worried that that means that fewer grantees will decide to partner with the federal government, and that could leave communities without access to federal dollars that Congress passed for their benefit. But you'll see here again another trend about trying to make it harder for nonprofits to access financial resources. Next slide. The other way that the administration and Congress, for that matter, have targeted nonprofits is by making it more challenging to raise charitable donations through changes to the tax code. So last July, in fact, it was just about 1 year ago today, Congress passed the One Big Beautiful Act, which was the major tax package that was signed into law last July. It included lots of different changes. There were some positive changes for nonprofits. They included a new universal tax deduction for charitable giving. So you no longer have to be an itemizer in order to get your charitable deduction. You can get one if you're like 90% of taxpayers and you don't itemize your deductions. That allows for individuals to claim up to $1,000 and married couples to claim up to $2,000. And in many ways, that's a great addition. It democratizes more giving. It encourages people at all income levels to give what they can. But the benefit of that positive outcome of the bill is outweighed by some of the other provisions that ultimately will reduce charitable giving by about $6 billion each year. Those changes include changes to corporate giving, so setting a floor before corporations can get the tax benefits of charitable giving, and a new floor and a new ceiling on high-income earners who itemize their tax deductions. And we know that high-income earners disproportionately give a lot of charitable giving to nonprofits. They're the lifeblood of many nonprofits. So changes to high-income earners means that they are much less likely to give as much as they have in the past. In addition to those tax provisions, though, we also saw other changes in the One Big Beautiful Act that put greater strain on nonprofits. So, for example, there are deep cuts to healthcare and food security in H.R. 1, which ultimately means that there's going to be more demand for nonprofit services in health and food security, but fewer resources to help those individuals. And those changes are going to put enormous strain on state budgets where they might have to further cut back on the resources they have or put in new taxes to make up the difference or cut from other funding areas that might benefit nonprofits. Next slide. But the financial threats that we're seeing to nonprofits aren't the only way that some in this administration and some in Congress are targeting nonprofits. I want to talk a little bit about the political targeting that we're seeing. Next slide. So there's been a lot of examples over the past 18 months where it seems clear to me, at least, that there are investigations, criminal charges, and threats that are being made to nonprofits, largely based on political targeting of of perceived opponents to the administration. So, for example, earlier on into the first year of the administration, DOJ launched an investigation into Open Society Foundations, which was founded by George Soros, who is very well known for funding progressive-leaning issues. So an investigation into Open Society, not because they announced that they had found evidence of wrongdoing, but that they were looking for wrongdoing, right? They wanted to see what they could find about Open Society. We also see that with more recent criminal charges that have been brought against Southern Poverty Law Center, which is a civil rights organization, that the administration has charged, saying that they have violated donor requirements, that they've been misleading donors because they use the donations that they raise to pay informants to infiltrate white supremacy groups. And then they turn that information over to the FBI or other law enforcement so that they can take action and help dismantle those white supremacy organizations. That's a practice that Southern Poverty Law Center had been engaged in for many, many years. They had a partnership with the FBI for many years to help bring down those hate groups. But under this administration, they're claiming that somehow, that allegedly that's violating the law and that they're misleading donors along those lines. But if you listen to how they talk about that case, what they really mention is that they just don't like what that organization has done. They don't like how that Southern Poverty Law Center has identified conservative-leaning groups as being hate groups. And so, it's clear, I think, to those folks in the nonprofit sector that this is really about political targeting more so than any alleged wrongdoing. But Southern Poverty Law Center, Open Society Foundations aren't the only organizations that are feeling the targeting right now. Over 400 investigations have been launched against nonprofits, many of them who work on civil rights issues or immigration issues. There hasn't been any evidence of wrongdoing that's been brought forward. And it's caused a lot of concern. If you look at the list of 400 organizations that now have active investigations against them, there's a pattern here of which types of organizations based on their mission are being focused on. Again, groups that work on immigration issues, civil rights organizations, LGBT organizations, or groups that work to advance racial equity. We've also seen threats to revoke tax-exempt status. Most notoriously, the president has threatened to revoke tax-exempt status from Harvard University, which has also faced other investigations based on their diversity, equity, and inclusion practices and allegations of anti-Semitism on their campus. The president does not have the authority to revoke tax-exempt status. In fact, it is a violation of criminal law for anyone within the administration to direct the IRS to investigate a group based on their tax-exempt status. But that hasn't stopped folks in the White House from threatening to do so. Of course, other organizations we've heard from are very concerned, too, that maybe their tax-exempt status could be taken away. And last spring, we had heard rumors from the Wall Street Journal. They had done some reporting that the administration was looking into broad, wholesale revocation of tax-exempt status, for example, for environmental organizations or groups that work on certain issues by redefining what is considered charitable under the tax law. And then finally, I'll say that there's a new congressional task force that has been created focused on defending constitutional rights and exposing institutional abuses. It has a very wide focus, but the chair of that task force, Representative Gill from Texas, has said that his intention is to investigate nonprofits and the work that they do. Next slide, please. We've also seen, in addition to the investigations and like the legal parameters of that political targeting, we also see something different here with this administration, which is escalating dangerous rhetoric that frames nonprofits as being enemies of the American people. And we're not just seeing folks in the administration do this, but there's increasingly a number of members of Congress, particularly on the House side, who's using this language to talk about the distrust that we as society should have in nonprofits. So, for example, claims that nonprofits are actually being controlled by foreign enemies, or that these foreign governments are using nonprofits to undermine our electoral system and are raising new questions about whether our elections are free and fair, accusing nonprofits of pushing political propaganda from foreign governments in violation of the Foreign Agent Registration Act and other laws. So we're seeing this rhetoric that paints nonprofits as somehow being foreign, somehow being under foreign influence, in large part to sow distrust between the American people and the nonprofits in their communities. Next slide, please. Just an example, these are 3 different hearings that have been held in congressional committees, talking about how, alleging that nonprofits somehow are fueling the immigration crisis, that they are pursuing a radical agenda, that they're using federal dollars to do so, or they're taking dollars from foreign governments. So really, increasingly, you're seeing this sort of language being used through the official channels of Congress. Next slide, please. I want to spend a little bit more time talking about the proposed changes to federal grant making, because that is a process that's underway right now. In fact, the public comment period goes through July 13th. So I wanted to make sure you had an opportunity to learn about this so you can take action if you are so inclined to do so. I'm going to share in the chat box a link to 2 different resources. One is a chart of the many different provisions that are included in this proposal. There's a lot. I mentioned there's 400 pages. So there's a lot to go over. I can't get into every single one on this presentation, but you can check out this chart at your leisure to see how these changes might impact the organizations that you work with. The second link brings you to a way that you can take action, 3 different ways to take action, and I'll talk about that in a little bit too. Next slide. So when I look across the changes that are in this proposed rule, I see 3 different trends when I look at the different types of changes that they're making. The first is that they create a new political process for selecting grantees. Many of us are used to the current process, which is very nonpartisan. Often when you apply for federal dollars, you might participate in a competition. Maybe they grade your grant proposal based on certain factors that they have to make public. The scoring is done by a team of experts, and the proposal that wins the most points wins the federal grant, right? Well, under this proposal, that process would fundamentally change. By that, I mean each federal agency would have to appoint a political appointee, so let's say the secretary of the agency, who would have the power to exclude grants or grantees if they felt like that grant proposal was not consistent with agency priorities or the national interest. And that those terms are not defined in any way. And so every new administration could come in with a new set of understandings of what it means to be in the national interest, and they could exclude whichever grants or grant proposals they feel like doing. They wouldn't have to provide a reason why they're excluding certain grants. Grantees wouldn't know if their grant was excluded under this process, and grantees wouldn't be able to appeal any decision to exclude them. So imagine you go through the competitive process for HUD homelessness grants. Your continuum of care in your community wins the highest score, so you are eligible for a grant award. But the political appointee at HUD says you're not eligible anymore because they don't like maybe the other policies that your local government has in place, or they don't like the work that a nonprofit does outside of their federal dollars. The other changes that they make here is that they allow federal agencies to look at what memberships you have or affiliations you have in determining whether or not you have connections to organizations that, quote, violate federal law, or compromise public safety or national security in any way. And while that might on its face sound pretty reasonable, that we might not want federal grantees that violate or associate with people who violate federal law, the challenge is that, again, what this administration says violates federal civil rights laws is very different than what the courts have said. And so this could be used to exclude grantees that work on racial equity issues or that engage in protests that the administration could say, or a future administration could say, undermines public safety. They also allow agencies or propose to allow agencies to terminate grants if grantees, quote, damage the reputation of the federal government. But it's unclear, well, what does it mean to damage the reputation of a federal agency? Could that be criticizing them publicly for a policy that you disagree with them on? Could that be some other fully lawful First Amendment activity? It's very unclear what that means, but the language is very vague and could be used and abused in many different ways. Next slide, please. So in addition to creating this new political process, let's say you get through that political process, next you'll be faced with the threat of a constantly shifting environment that makes it much more difficult to actually administer federal grants. So under the proposal, agencies could terminate contracts or grants midway through performance. They could suspend grants without cause. So even if a grantee is meeting certain benchmarks or is meeting their grant terms under this proposal, federal agencies could just terminate grants at any moment. This also means that they could terminate grants that were previously awarded under a prior administration, but when this administration comes in, they say, we don't like this funding anymore. We're going to terminate your funds starting today. No notice would be given to grantees to help them wind down federal programs. So if you spend a lot of resources building up capacity, hiring staff, training staff, buying equipment, setting up programs, a lot of that could be for naught because the funding could be terminated almost overnight. The other changes that they are proposing is to allow agencies to add new terms and conditions midway through performance. So again, grantees wouldn't necessarily know what the rules of the road are before they accept a federal grant. You could be working under the assumption that your grant is going to work a certain way. Let's say that you're going to get an advance payment of 25% of your grant total. They can change that to being a reimbursement model midway through performance. And not all nonprofits are going to have the cash flow to change on a dime to that new way of accepting federal dollars. Under that discretionary authority, federal agencies would not have to provide grantees any notice or any hearings or any appeals process. You'd be faced with new terms and conditions or termination, but not have any way to challenge that. And they could just withhold discretionary grants indefinitely. If they decide that they don't think any grantee is up to snuff or any grant proposal is good enough, or if they think that it doesn't advance the president's policy priorities, they could just indefinitely withhold those funds and never make an award to any grantees. Next slide. The last place where we see, I see a trend line through the 400 pages is that it very directly is targeting federal programs that work to address racial or social inequities. So for example, the proposal would bar federal funding from being used to promote unlawful DEI efforts or illegal immigration. But there's not a lot of clarity about what that means. I've mentioned many times now that what the administration says is unlawful DEI is not what courts have said is illegal DEI. But it's also unclear which federal programs fall under that category. Does that include housing programs or fair housing programs that work to address racial inequities in the housing market? Does that include other efforts that increase green space in urban areas? You could imagine that this administration or a future administration could define DEI extremely broadly, and you wouldn't know whether or not that applies to your federal dollars or not. Likewise, barring funds being used for illegal immigration, it's unclear. Let's say you operate a homelessness shelter. and you serve the general population, but you don't check for citizenship before you serve individuals. And for homeless shelters, that's for good reason, because you want people not to sleep on the street. You want to help people get rehoused as quickly as possible. Well, would that count as promoting illegal immigration if some of the people you're serving are undocumented? And what about programs that are intended to serve undocumented people, like legal aid services for asylum seekers who are looking to lawfully enter the United States? So it's very unclear about how these provisions would be interpreted, and each administration could do so in a very different way. Okay, next slide, please. I'm going to skip this slide. There's lots of other changes to get to. We'll go to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit about one more thing, which is what I worry about here is really about the increased legal threats to grantees if they choose to take on federal funds. And when you take the proposal that we're talking about here at OMB over grant making, and you also look at the changes I mentioned earlier about the new certifications that grantees would have to apply for, it could be read to allow a new level of legal harassment against grantees. So, for example, under the proposal, agencies would be encouraged to work with third parties to file litigation against grantees if they don't meet their grant requirements. So let's say you apply for a federal grant and you mess up, which happens from time to time, right? So not only are you in trouble now with the federal government, but you could face a third-party lawsuit claiming that you're violating the False Claims Act, and subjecting you to new legal harassment in the courts. You'd have to spend time and energy and staff resources and funding to hire attorneys to represent you in court. And every dollar, of course, that you're spending on that legal assistance is a dollar that you're not putting towards your mission and the communities that you serve. In particular, I'm worried that this could be used to file third-party litigation against grantees who work on racial equity issues, or who serve undocumented immigrants, because that matches the language that was in the certification proposal as well. So you could see here that that puts an enormous pressure on nonprofits to forego their missions in order to accept federal dollars. Next slide. So when you take all of those together, when you look at all of the changes, I see a couple of different impacts here. One is it's very clearly trying to force nonprofits to back away from their missions in order to apply for federal dollars to serve their community. So many nonprofits have a deep commitment to racial equity. They want to welcome immigrants. They serve the LGBTQ community. Well, if those organizations want to pursue their work, they'll be faced with enormous pressure to walk away from those missions in order to accept federal dollars. The other risk is that it increases, as I've mentioned before, the financial risk, the legal risk of accepting federal dollars. And many nonprofits might decide that they can't take on that additional risk, and they might decide not to apply for federal dollars. It would deter their participation in federal programs, which means that if there aren't grantees on the ground who are qualified, who can deliver services, it could mean that there are service disruptions for the people and communities that rely on nonprofits for the services that they need. Next slide. So there's a couple of things you can do, and the second link I shared with you has a link to all of these, but we're encouraging groups to submit a public comment by July 13th in opposition to the proposal. You can use a link to our comment guide that gives talking points and instructions about how to submit a comment. We don't anticipate the administration is going to make changes based on the comments that we provide. That's not our goal here. Our goal is to submit as many comments as possible, unique comments with unique points of view, because it slows down the process. Because they have to review all comments that have been submitted and address the concerns that are raised. But it also helps lay the foundation for future litigation. So if you want to help participate in that and hopefully stop this proposal altogether, you can think about submitting a public comment by the end of the day on Monday. The other thing that you can do is sign on to our national letter opposing the proposal. There's a link to that too. You can do both. You can submit a public comment and sign on to our letter. And the last thing is to be engaging your members of Congress to urge them to take action. So in this case, I think Democrats are pretty well aware of these issues, but it's still important that they hear from you about what the proposal would mean for your ability to deliver federal grants. But probably most important that you're talking to Republicans in Congress and encouraging them to weigh in behind the scenes with the White House to lift up these concerns and to encourage them to slow down, to work with Congress, to work with stakeholders to fix these issues before they finalize it. And when we've had conversations with Republicans in Congress, they've actually been very receptive to these concerns. I think they've also seen how chaotic the last 18 months has been as federal grants have been cut off overnight and then turned back on and then they're turned back off. I think everyone can agree that once Congress comes to a decision about how much funding a program should get, the process for grantees has to be stable and predictable, or else it's very hard to have federal programs work as well as they should. Okay, next slide, please. And you can go one further. Next slide. So there's a couple other things we can do when we take that larger context. What are other actions that you can take as a nonprofit? Next slide. I think it's really important that we check in with our staff and with the organization as a whole to make sure that your staff feel protected and well in the work that they do. There have been a number of increased security risks that organizations are facing. An open invitation to any of you, if you feel like you're being targeted by the administration, whether through investigations or otherwise, if you're seeing an increased security threats, whether that's cybersecurity or physical security, please reach out to us. We're happy to connect you with some free resources that you can use to help make sure that you and your staff are as protected as possible. The second thing that I think it's important for us to do is to continue to do our important work, right? We don't want to see nonprofits walk away from their missions and their essential work and to comply in advance with this pressure that we're seeing from the administration. So it's really important that you keep focused on the work, the incredible work that you're doing, and keep doing a great job of it. And that we find ways to advocate not just on behalf of our individual organizations, but on the sector as a whole. And then lastly, I think it's important that we're staying unified. So far, I think over the last 18 months, when the sector has spoken with one voice, when we've acted together in coordination with one another, we have been very successful at stopping bad policies from going forward. And so we can take a lesson from that and actively cultivate within ourselves and our organizations this idea that if there's an attack on one of us, there's an attack on all of us, that the sector as a whole is going to be less vibrant and able to succeed if we allow each new administration to come in and target the nonprofits that they happen to disagree with. So with that, I'm going to stop there and see if folks have any questions or any comments about how this is impacting them. Go for it, Deborah.
I just have one comment, which is that I was working on a grant for a client, and this was a grant for homelessness diversion and innovation funds. So it was at the state level and funding coming down from HUD and other federal agencies. And one of the things that the team had encountered was kind of an increased feeling of empowerment on the local level for more punitive policies. So they were seeing much more restrictive and punitive policies towards homeless individuals. Things like restricting access to service providers so that people could not get service, corralling people behind gates and fences, and if they couldn't be put in place somewhere quickly, which they can't because there's hardly any place to put them, then they'll be sent to jail, things like that. So that's been kind of shocking to see this kind of feeling of empowerment on a local level that, well, we can do this, go this more punitive route, and particularly on the part of people who previously I had witnessed doing things to help people instead.
Yeah,
So it
that's a
creates this kind of environment.
that's a great example of how we're seeing this trickle from the federal government down to the state and local government. And I see that in other ways too. The administration has threatened to label nonprofits as domestic terrorist organizations. And then we've seen a number of states pass similar legislation at the state level, also empowering governors to identify nonprofits as being terrorist organizations as well. So what we see happen at the federal level is often copycatted in states across the country, and it's very hard. It's challenging. It's hard to push back on, piece by piece. And I think you're bringing up something really important here that we should all be aware of, that how this could trickle down to your state and local politics too. Helene.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I found it extremely interesting and right on point with what we're dealing with. I'm the grants coordinator for the Austining School District in Austining, New York. And we work with many state and federal grants. So these changes have really hit the district. And I'm just curious. I mean, one of our grants was canceled altogether. It was New York Year Up, and that was through the federal government. And then we have, and a lot of the people on this call know my woes, but a large mental health grant through the Department of Education. And I'm just curious if I could pick your brain of what you think is going to happen, because you had mentioned that you have the grant and then they cancel it and then they give it back to you. And that's exactly what we're experiencing in some of the terminology that you had there, that they canceled the grant because it was against the administration's position or whatever the terminology is. But, we had the grant and then they canceled it and then they came back and opened it up because it's under litigation. We got a chunk of money, then they came back and gave us more money. And then we just found out yesterday we're getting a little bit more money. So I'm just curious if it's under litigation. This is under litigation in the state of Washington for some reason, but what are your thoughts? And I know you don't know for sure, no one can say, but do you think the grant is through a year from December? So we have between now and December, and it was activated through the end of December, but no more money, just a little chunk of money. And then we're supposed to have year 5. What do you think? Do you think that at some point we'll just get the grant and they'll just be sick of us? Or are they going to drag us through this for the next, I guess, 18 months? Because I can't handle this. Is
I know,
not for the
Helene,
faint
but
of heart.
that is the intention here, right? It's the intention is to create a lot of chaos, to exhaust us, to burn us out, right? And so I'd say, as much as possible, if you can connect with folks in this group and elsewhere to get the feelings out and then go back the next day to fight another fight, I think you're going to have to do that, because I think we're going to see a lot more continued disruptions over the next several years. It's really important, though, that we're thinking about a couple of different tactics, though, to help, things that you can do to help protect federal dollars. One is to help with litigation in any way, or connect with groups that are litigating. If you have a connection to those groups in Washington, for example, they might have brought that case in Washington because I think the courts might be more amenable to their arguments there. So litigation is a new tool. It was new for us too. We had never sued in our 40-year history until last January. And now we've filed 4 lawsuits and we've been very successful in them. And it's a really important tool that I think a lot of nonprofits overlook. So I'd say stay connected to your state AGs, stay connected to your statewide associations, your local associations, to find an opportunity to connect with other people who are in a similar situation or to help litigate. The other thing you can do is engage with your members of Congress, because there have been places, you might remember, Helene, where overnight they canceled SAMHSA grants. And then within 24 hours, they were turned back online. Well, it was turned back online because a whole bunch of Republican senators said, what are you doing? We need these grants in our community. And they we're able to turn it back online. So engaging with your members of Congress is incredibly important. And that's not to say that we're going to be successful at doing that 100% of the time, but we have to think about all the different tactics that we can use to try to keep the funding flows going. But I don't have an answer on that specific program other than to take a deep breath and take a
The
bath
trend,
and then
is the
get back.
trend that they're getting tired of us and they'll just say, okay, take your money and leave me alone. And they're spending, I also wonder about how much money they're spending on all this litigation. If the idea was to try to save money, I think they've exceeded, the
Yeah.
cost just
Well,
from
I think the
this.
thing that for you to think about is they know that in many cases they're going to lose the lawsuit. And so you and I might say, well, why waste your time setting up a situation where you're going to get sued and you're going to lose? And that's because you can still do enormous harm to organizations while lawsuits are playing out, right? The court system is slow. And in the meantime, if you don't have access to those federal dollars, it means, we're hearing from nonprofits all the time that are cutting back on the services they provide, or they're laying off staff, or they are closing their doors. And once that infrastructure is lost, it is incredibly hard to bring it back online. And I think we have to be very clear-eyed that that's part of the intention too. If my theory is correct, which I think it is that they are very clearly targeting the nonprofit sector because nonprofits are one of the last trusted institutions in our communities. People work directly with nonprofits and have an affinity to them. And nonprofits are a core part of civil society. They're an independent voice, and many of them, exercise their freedoms to push back on administration policies. And so there's a reason why they're targeting nonprofits, and it's because we play that powerful role in our communities. And so we can't give up that power. We need to lean into it like you've been doing. So I appreciate you raising that.
Sarah, Cecilia has her hand up, and then we also have a question in the chat. So,
Yeah, wonderful.
Cecilia.
Thanks so much for this, Sarah. It's super clear and helpful. Question about the SAM registration. So I'm the director of institutional partnerships for Union Theological Seminary in New York City. We're a progressive, interreligious, interfaith seminary. We recently renewed our SAM registration just in May. But you're saying, if I'm understanding you correctly, if this passes, then the next time we would go around to renew our SAM registration, we might be required to comply with the different, litmus tests that you described. Is that correct?
Yes, I will say that is if this were to be implemented, yes, you might be the next time you renew, you might be asked to sign those new certifications. But for both that issue and this federal grant making issue, we're a long ways away before it's decided about whether or not that will be implemented. And that's because I'm pretty sure there's going to be litigation on both fronts. And we'll want to see all of that litigation play out before before you take any actions on your end to change any policies that you have, right? I think we have a very strong argument that both of those actions violate the First Amendment. And so we'll want to see how that plays out in courts first. So that sort of goes to Ali's question about, is it worth applying for federal grants in blue states? And I'd say for now, we don't need to make any changes to how we apply for or administer federal grants, because if and when we get to the place, let's say there is litigation and we're not successful for some reason, I can come back to you and share with you advice about how to specifically address those new legal requirements, but we're not there yet. We're gonna let the fight continue until we know what is happening.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just looking to see, should we take it off the list to renew the SAM registration? But it sounds like we should continue until it comes to a point where we might really be in trouble. So
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And the last thing I'd want to see is, organizations like yours that might have a commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, voluntarily walking away from that core mission or that core principle of the work that you do, because that's sort of giving them what they want, which is they want to intimidate organizations and discourage them from focusing on their missions. And our job as nonprofits is to be independent voices fighting for the things that our community wants us to fight for.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yes, I believe there's a question in the chat.
No,
And
we took care of those.
Yeah.
oh, I'm so sorry, I missed that. About that.
No worries.
I wonder if mid-year elections will have any impact on sort of the chaos and attacks that have been happening in the next 2.5 years might be, or I guess 2 years at that point might be a little bit different.
Yeah, it's
I
hard to
know it's
predict.
speculation. Yeah.
Yeah, it's hard to predict what will happen in the elections. But many people think that it's a possibility that Democrats, for example, could win the House. It is much easier, I think, for nonprofits to push back against these challenges when there is divided government. And that's always the case. I'll say whenever it's one party in charge of both the House, the Senate, and the White House, politics becomes a lot more difficult here in DC. So if there is a divided Congress, I think that's helpful for nonprofits. And it gives a little bit more cover, I think, to Republicans who might also share the concerns that we have. And it allows Democrats to use the leverage that they have to push for changes or to block certain proposals that are harmful. So we'll see what happens in November. But I suspect that, if the election comes back and Democrats have won at least one chamber in Congress, that could make it easier for us to push back on harmful things.
I have another question, and it may be a naive question, but whenever the funders are announcing different funds, the goal is to spend that money. So when you're dealing with a private foundation, they have a purpose for allocating funds for certain reasons. I'm assuming it's the same thing with the federal government. So they're allocating these funds for certain reasons. If they're making it so challenging to access the funds and to use them, I don't want to say what are they going to do with the money, because we all sort of can figure that out. But there is a goal to spend this money on, purpose A, B, and C. So who's going to spend the money?
Helene, I think you're confusing. That might be Congress's goal. Congress has a goal when it passes spending bills to have a certain amount of money go out for different programs. And the beauty of spending bills is that it is by definition a bipartisan process, right? So Republicans have to get the spending that they want in order for Democrats to get the spending that they want. There's a trade-off, there's a negotiation, they reach a compromise, and they pass a spending bill. But an administration has a different goal and this administration has said that they have a different goal when it comes to the spending. And Russ Vought, who leads OMB, has said, that they don't see the spending directions from Congress as being a requirement. They say that's the ceiling of the most we can spend is $100 million on X, Y, and Z. And that if they can, they want to spend less. And so if they're able to get through the year without spending those funds, they see that as a win because they want to dramatically reduce the size of the federal government, dramatically reduce federal spending, and in the process, cut off resources for nonprofits whose work they might not support or disfavor, right? So I don't think that Russ Vought shares the same goal as Congress does in making sure that those funds are spent.
I have a question. This is Sheba Abraham, and I would like to know, being that you have these religious organizations that have quite a few of them have started pantries, food pantries, clothing drives, what's going to happen when the nonprofits, like you say, like you have your no pun intended, United Ways, Planned Parenthood, certain services that are provided to the community? Were the churches as nonprofits required to pick up that slack in some way? And what's going to happen with that? Because um, it's going to be a lot for churches unless they come together as a unit to support those funds that are being depleted by the government or taken away by the government. What's going to happen? How are they going to fare in all of this going on?
I think that's a great question, Sheba. And if you look at what happened last fall when there was a government shutdown, The administration withheld funding for SNAP recipients. That was another place where NCN filed litigation and won. But they didn't want to spend dollars that were set aside by Congress specifically for that purpose of funding SNAP. And what we saw was a dramatic increase in demand for local food banks and food pantries, often ones that are operated in partnership with churches or religious organizations, because there's all of a sudden so much more need in their community. People who were either federal workers and didn't have their paychecks coming in and needed food assistance, or people who weren't able to access their SNAP benefits. You know, they still need groceries. They don't want to go hungry, so they turn to their local nonprofits, whether it's religiously affiliated or not. And there's just no way that philanthropy or churches or houses of worship can fill in the gaps for what the federal government does. And everybody, tries their best. I know many nonprofits in that time were trying to do everything they possibly could to serve as many people as they could, but it is a really challenging situation where more people were going to go hungry because they didn't have access to those federal dollars. So I think we could see that happening more and more if federal dollars are cut off and nonprofits aren't able to access them to serve their communities. The needs don't go away. The demand is still there. There are just fewer resources to help people.
Deb?
I have a couple of questions. I don't know if you want to go over time, but I guess one of my questions is, as a taxpayer, what I'm seeing is fewer services and no reduction in my tax bill. And I'm wondering if you're seeing any reaction to this throughout the land, if people are kind of picking up on this. And I guess the other question that I have is in terms of 2027 post-election and provisions in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, is there additional pain that we can expect that was structured that way to happen after the election?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'll start with the second one. I'm not an expert on Medicaid and SNAP, so I know that there were further changes made, for example, on improper payment standards that go into effect after the election on Medicaid, but I'm not the right person for to share that information with you guys, but I'm happy to put you in contact with another speaker who might be helpful. And then for taxpayers, I think that there's a delay, right? Like nonprofits are going to feel this pain first, and a lot of nonprofits are going to do everything they can to protect their communities from the harm, but eventually it'll trickle through. And I don't think we haven't yet heard from taxpayers, I think, who have been directly impacted by these funding cuts yet. But if it continues, we definitely will start to hear from folks.
Thank you. And thank you for your work.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure speaking with all of you. And if anybody needs any help or has any further questions, I'm happy to chat with you.
Thank you, Sarah. This was wonderful.
Yes.
Thank you.
We especially appreciate you taking time from the beach, your beach trip to do this.
Don't worry, I got my bathing suit underneath this. Head out to the pool.
Yeah, it's so informative, just to hear all the different strategies that are being employed that are not so obvious.
Yeah.
So thanks again.
All right. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to head out. Nice talking with all of you guys today. Take care.
You too. Thanks,
Thank
Sarah.
you too. Bye now.
Good day, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See you at the next Connections call.
Yeah. Have a good one.
Bye.